In the cobblestone streets of Cartagena, under the relentless sun of 1843, a black woman walked with her head held high, carrying documents that would change the course of events. These were not the parchments of her own emancipation. It was a much more resounding act, the acquisition contract for her former mistress. The very woman who had marked her with a red-hot iron now belonged to her. This is the true story of how fate can weave such unprecedented reversals that it seems to be traced by the hand of divine justice. Before we delve into this narrative, turn on notifications, as it contains details never recorded in the annals. Every moment reveals a twist that will leave you speechless. It was the year 1823. Maria Clementia arrived at the vast estate of the Villanueva family when she was just 8 years old. She was acquired at the port's slave market, torn from her mother's arms, whom she would never see again. Her price was 40 gold pesos, less than a thoroughbred horse. Doña Catalina de Villanueva was renowned throughout Cartagena, not for her beauty or refinement, but for the meticulous cruelty with which she treated her slaves. Aged 32, widowed by a Spanish merchant who had bequeathed her properties and a considerable fortune, she had no children of her own. She transmuted the suffering of others into her sole means of feeling power. Maria Clementia quickly learned the rigors of this household, waking before dawn, drawing icy water from the well, preparing her mistress's breakfast exactly as she liked it. Thick chocolate, egg-based arroz, and fruit peeled and cut into perfect quarters. A single mistake meant the whip. 2 mistakes meant the stocks in the courtyard under the midday sun. The city of Cartagena was buzzing with change. Independence from Spain had occurred barely 2 decades earlier, bringing with it promises of freedom that never reached those who needed it most urgently. Laws stipulated that children of slaves born after 1821 would be free on their 18th birthday. But for those already branded, chained to their masters, freedom was just an empty word floating in the humid Caribbean air. Doña Catalina observed a singular custom. Whenever a slave gravely displeased her, she was not content with ordinary corporal punishment. She would order the branding iron, bearing her initial, an ornate S, to be brought and heated until it glowed like hell. The mark imprinted on the right shoulder remained visible, indelible, an implacable reminder of the extent of her power. Maria Clementia received her mark at the age of 12. Her offense was spilling a drop of coffee on her mistress's favorite silk dress during a social reception. The pain was so intense that she lost consciousness. When she awoke, the smell of burnt flesh still permeated the air, and Doña Catalina stared down at her, a satisfied smile on her lips. The years passed like a contained eternity. Maria Clementia grew, observing, learning, burying each humiliation in a corner of her mind where resentment transformed into something colder and more calculated. Determination. Don Sebastian Montes was Doña Catalina's accountant, a freed mulatto man who kept the hacienda's records. He was born free because his Spanish father had acknowledged him, a virtually unheard-of privilege. He visited the grand estate every week to examine the accounts, and something in the gaze of Maria Clementia, then 16, caught his attention. It was not pity he felt, but recognition. He detected in her the same spark that had animated him, that thirst to be more than what destiny had ordained. One afternoon, while waiting in the courtyard, Don Sebastian left his account book open. Maria Clementia, presumed illiterate like all slaves, approached. Her eyes scanned the numbers with a speed that astonished him. She did not just recognize the symbols, she deciphered them, she understood them. Thus began a clandestine education. In the brief moments when Doña Catalina was absent for her social engagements, Don Sebastian first taught her numbers, addition, subtraction, multiplication, the foundations of commerce. Then came letters, scribbled in the sand of the courtyard and erased immediately. Maria Clementia was an insatiable student. She memorized everything from the first explanation. In a month, she mastered basic operations. In a year, she could read entire contracts and grasp every clause. Don Sebastian was stunned but also worried. Knowledge in the hands of a slave was a dangerous weapon, both for the one who possessed it and for the one who concealed it. However, Maria Clementia was nurturing a plan that was just beginning to emerge. She observed how Doña Catalina managed her affairs, her properties, her investments. The mistress was rich, but lacked financial acumen. She spent on imported jewelry and dresses, on ostentatious parties that impressed no one. Her properties yielded less than they should have, because her cruelty encouraged slaves to provide only minimal effort to avoid punishment, never with true motivation. By the age of 20, Maria Clementia had forged within herself a quality that Doña Catalina could never acquire: strategic patience. She did not think of escaping. She dreamed of something much more ambitious, though she still did not know how to achieve it. The turning point occurred when Don Sebastian confided something to her in a low voice while they were examining the warehouse inventories. The law of manumission allowed slaves to purchase their own freedom if they managed to raise a sufficient sum of money. The price was negotiable but generally equivalent to the slave's market value. For a young, robust woman like Maria Clementia, this represented about 200 gold pesos, an unattainable fortune, or at least it seemed that way. Destiny uses singular ways to offer opportunities. For Maria Clementia, it took the form of an accounting error that no one else noticed. Doña Catalina had inherited several port properties, warehouses that she rented to merchants. Don Sebastian managed the collections, but the mistress insisted on personally checking the registers each month, not out of diligence but out of mistrust. It was one of her countless contradictions. She mistrusted everyone except her own judgment, which was deficient. In March, one of the tenants paid twice in the same month due to a misunderstanding. Don Sebastian recorded both payments, but during the verification with Doña Catalina, she only focused on the first entry. The second payment remained recorded in the general ledgers but not in the mistress's personal notebook. Maria Clementia noticed the error, and at that moment, with the clarity of a revelation, she understood that the flaws in the system could prove more valuable than gold itself. She began to pay obsessive attention to the register when Don Sebastian left them for a moment. She memorized the records, the dates on which cash collections were made without detailed receipts, and the periods when the accounting became nebulous due to Doña Catalina's own negligence. If you think you can guess the outcome of this story, wait. What follows defies all logic of the time and proves that intelligence can be more powerful than any chain. Don Sebastian noticed Maria Clementia's increasingly keen interest. One night, after Doña Catalina had retired to her apartments, he questioned her directly about her intentions. She did not lie. With a calm that contrasted with the audacity of her design, she explained that she wished to acquire her freedom, not by begging for it, but by conquering it with the same instruments that white people used: money and knowledge. The proposal she made to Don Sebastian was audacious but brilliant. She would identify opportunities to improve the profitability of Doña Catalina's properties. Minor efficiencies that the mistress would never notice. He would negotiate better prices with suppliers, reduce waste, and optimize delivery routes. The savings made, invisible to Doña Catalina, but very real in the accounts, could be gradually diverted. This was not theft in the traditional sense. It was more subtle. It was about ensuring that money wasted through inefficiency ceased to be wasted and was set aside rather than simply evaporating in the administrative chaos of the hacienda. Don Sebastian remained silent for many minutes. Then he assented, not out of fear, but because he recognized the extraordinary when he saw it. If Maria Clementia achieved this feat, she would be the first slave in Cartagena's history to buy her freedom through pure financial cunning, without donation or favor. The next 3 years were marked by a patience that would have broken anyone with less determination. Maria Clementia and Don Sebastian executed their plans with surgical precision. They started modestly. A port warehouse was storing goods inefficiently, paying for more space than necessary. Maria Clementia suggested a reorganization. Don Sebastian implemented it as if it were his own idea. The monthly saving, 3 pesos, a trifle for Doña Catalina, but the starting point for everything for Maria Clementia. They identified a fabric supplier who was overcharging, knowing that no one checked comparative prices. They changed suppliers without Doña Catalina noticing. Monthly saving, an additional 5 pesos. Thus, little by little, they built an invisible money flow. Don Sebastian opened a discreet account in the name of a fictitious merchant. The savings were deposited there. On paper, they appeared to be legitimate maintenance and operating expenses. In reality, they represented the methodical accumulation of the price of freedom. Doña Catalina, absorbed by her own excesses, never noticed that her properties were generating more money than she was sending out. For her, as long as she had enough to maintain her ostentatious lifestyle, details were superfluous. Maria Clementia led a double existence. By day, the submissive slave who carried out every order without question. By night, in stolen moments, the strategist who studied every aspect of her mistress's affairs with more devotion than Doña Catalina herself. There were moments of dread. Once Doña Catalina questioned why maintenance expenses for one of the warehouses had increased. Don Sebastian, with admirable calm, explained that new municipal taxes had increased costs. It was a lie, but he presented falsified documents that the mistress only glanced at before approving them with a disdainful gesture. In 1843, Maria Clementia was 24 years old and had accumulated 180 pesos. She only needed 20 more pesos to reach the estimated price of her freedom. She was so close she could feel its tangibility, its very reality. But then, an unforeseen event occurred that would overturn the entire plan. In July 1843, Doña Catalina fell ill. Nothing serious at first, just a persistent fever that she attributed to Cartagena's unbearable heat. But weeks passed, and the fever did not subside. Doctors came and went, prescribing bleedings and tonics that were useless. The illness weakened her more than anyone could have imagined. By August, Doña Catalina could barely get out of bed. Her face, previously round and always flushed with anger or wine, had become emaciated and pale. Her voice, once powerful and heavy with sharp commands, was now only a faint murmur. Maria Clementia nursed her, not out of affection, but out of duty. But as she changed the sweat-soaked sheets and prepared the infusions prescribed by the doctors, she observed. She saw the woman who had been her torment for 2 decades fading, vulnerable and frightened. One detail did not escape her. Doña Catalina had no direct heirs. She had distant cousins in Spain who had never visited her, but no close relatives could claim the inheritance without delay. And without an updated will, her properties would enter a legal limbo that could last months, even years. Don Sebastian visited the sick woman and examined the state of the finances. In private, he confided to Maria Clementia what she had already suspected. If Doña Catalina were to die, everything would become complicated. The slaves would probably be sold to pay off debts and legal fees. Maria Clementia could end up in even crueler hands, and all the accumulated money would remain inaccessible. Action had to be taken quickly. Don Sebastian prepared the manumission documents. The price, 200 pesos, the standard market value for a 24-year-old slave. Maria Clementia had 180. She was missing 20. On the night of August 15th, Don Sebastian did something that could have cost him dearly. He falsified the final receipt. In the ledger, it appeared that Maria Clementia had completed the payment. In reality, the last 20 pesos had never existed. It was a calculated risk amidst the administrative chaos caused by Doña Catalina's illness. The next morning, with Doña Catalina barely conscious and weakened, Don Sebastian presented the documents for her signature. He explained in simple, urgent terms that it was a formality to release assets that would protect her estate. Doña Catalina, clouded by fever and vaguely trusting what her accountant knew how to do, signed. Maria Clementia was free. Freedom came without celebration, without tears of joy. Maria Clementia left the grand estate on a Wednesday at dusk, her manumission papers clutched to her chest, and a determination that burned more fiercely than ever. Nothing was finished. Everything was just beginning. In the following weeks, while Doña Catalina slowly recovered from her illness, Maria Clementia settled into a small room in the Gethsemane neighborhood. It was cramped and hot, but it was hers. For the first time in her life, she could close a door and be alone without fearing an order or punishment. However, she did not passively enjoy this freedom. With Don Sebastian as a silent partner, she began to work as a commercial intermediary. She knew the port business better than many merchants, having studied operations for years. She connected sellers and buyers, negotiated commissions, and identified opportunities that others missed. Her unique asset: she was a freed black woman in a city where this was rare but not impossible. White merchants underestimated her. They thought they could trick her. A fatal mistake. Maria Clementia knew every trick, every price hike, every hidden clause. She negotiated with a quiet firmness that disconcerted men accustomed to intimidation. In 6 months, she had multiplied her capital. Her initial pesos turned into hundreds, then thousands. She invested in goods that she knew would increase in value. She bought low when others had to sell quickly. She sold high when demand was strong. Doña Catalina recovered her health, but not entirely. The illness had left her weakened, and her temperament became even more unpredictable. She dismissed Don Sebastian in a fit of unfounded paranoia, accusing him of embezzlement without proof. He left without protesting, knowing that any defense would only worsen the situation. The hacienda began to decline without his competent management. Tenants were late with payments, suppliers overcharged. The remaining slaves worked less in the absence of effective supervision. Doña Catalina, who had never truly understood the functioning of her affairs, saw her fortune erode without grasping the reason. In December 1843, an extraordinary piece of news reached Maria Clementia's ears. Doña Catalina was considering selling some of her properties. Debts were mounting, medical expenses had been exorbitant, and she needed immediate cash. Among the assets she planned to sell was one Maria Clementia knew intimately: the port warehouse, the first source of her savings. Its market value was around 700 pesos. But Doña Catalina, desperate and poorly advised, was ready to accept less for a quick sale. Maria Clementia had exactly 650 pesos. She made an offer of 600, payable immediately in cash. For Doña Catalina, who did not recognize her former slave in the businesswoman facing her, it was an unexpected blessing. The transaction was concluded in a week. Maria Clementia now owned a property she had once secretly administered as a slave. The irony was palpable, but it was not enough. The year 1844 began with Doña Catalina caught in a downward spiral that seemed inescapable. Property sales had not solved her problems because she did not know how to manage what remained. She spent more than she earned, maintained a lifestyle she could no longer afford, and rejected the advice of anyone who tried to help her. Maria Clementia, meanwhile, prospered. Her warehouse generated consistent profits. She had hired free workers, paid them fair wages, and discovered a truth Doña Catalina would never understand. People worked better when they felt valued. Her reputation as an honest but firm businesswoman flourished. In March, Doña Catalina put the grand estate itself up for sale, her last valuable property. The asking price was 2,000 pesos, but everyone in Cartagena knew it was overvalued. The house was magnificent, but it needed significant repairs that Doña Catalina had ignored for years. Moreover, it came with the legal burden of 3 slaves she still owned, 2 elderly individuals and a 14-year-old girl. Potential buyers were scarce. The house was too large for most, too expensive for a property requiring additional investment. Weeks passed without serious offers. Maria Clementia watched from a distance. She estimated the house's true value at 1,500 pesos. She had 900 in cash after reinvesting a portion of her profits. It was not enough, but she had learned that in business, immediate cash was worth more than future promises, especially for a person in distress. What is about to happen is not fiction. It is the moment when history takes such a powerful turn that it redefines the very meaning of justice. Do not miss a single moment of what follows. In April, Maria Clementia requested a meeting with the notary managing the sale. She presented herself as a merchant, expressed interest in the property, and asked if Doña Catalina would consider a lower offer if payment was made entirely in cash, without delay or conditions. The notary, a pragmatic man who knew Doña Catalina had an urgent need for liquidity, agreed to present the proposal: 900 pesos plus the assumption of a 100 peso debt that Doña Catalina owed to a port merchant. Total in cash, 1,000 pesos. When Doña Catalina received the offer, her first reaction was to reject it with indignation. 1,000 pesos for a property that had cost 3,000 when her late husband acquired it? It was an insult, but her pride clashed with brutal reality. There were no other offers. Creditors were pressing. She needed money immediately, not promises of better future prices that might never materialize. The notary advised her to accept. He argued that 1,000 pesos would allow her to settle her immediate debts, and that she would even have funds left to move into a more modest dwelling or even save if she was prudent. Was it this or face foreclosure? Doña Catalina, tears of humiliation in her eyes, signed the sales contract without ever asking the buyer's name. It was indifferent to her. She only wanted the shame of having to sell her home to cease. The deed was registered on April 28, 1844. The new owner of the grand estate, including its furniture and the 3 slaves who still resided there, was Maria Clementia, the former slave of Doña Catalina de Villanueva. The day Maria Clementia again stepped onto the grounds of the grand estate as its owner, the Cartagena sky was clear, and the sun shone with an intensity that seemed symbolic. She carried the property titles in a leather folder, walking with her back straight, unhurriedly. Doña Catalina had left the house a few days earlier, moving into a rented dwelling in a less upscale neighborhood. But Maria Clementia sent for her. She had important matters to discuss regarding the terms of the transaction, the messenger explained. When Doña Catalina arrived at what had been her home, she found Maria Clementia sitting in the same living room where she used to receive guests. She recognized her instantly. The shock was so profound that she had to lean against the doorframe. Maria Clementia did not bother with superfluous explanations. In a calm, almost gentle voice, she stated the facts. She was now the owner of the property. The 3 slaves Doña Catalina had left would be freed that very day. They would not be sold or transferred. They would be free with their papers and the option to stay and work at the house for a salary if they wished. Doña Catalina tried to speak, but the words choked in her throat. Maria Clementia continued. There was a room for Doña Catalina in the house if she needed it, not as mistress but as a tenant. The rent would be modest, commensurate with what she could pay with the remainder of the sale, or she could leave and never return. The choice was hers. The former mistress collapsed into a chair, her face contorted by disbelief and something even deeper, the devastating understanding of what had just happened. It was not just that she had lost everything, it was that she had lost it to the only person she had never imagined capable of such a thing. Maria Clementia approached, knelt before her to meet her eyes, and spoke words that Doña Catalina would carry to her grave. You taught me that power is the only thing that matters in this world. You were right, but you forgot to teach me that power changes hands when one least expects it. She rose, walked to the window, and contemplated the city stretching towards the sea. Then, without turning around, she added, You may stay if you agree to live under my roof as I lived under yours. Or you may leave and never return. But if you stay, you will follow my rules. And my first rule is this. No one living in this house will ever again be the property of another. Doña Catalina never responded. She rose with difficulty. She left the house without a backward glance and never returned. She would spend her last years in increasingly cramped rented rooms, supported by the charity of acquaintances who had feared her when she held power and now pitied her. Maria Clementia remained by the window long after her former mistress left, gazing at the horizon where the Caribbean met the sky. She felt neither triumph nor joy. She experienced something more complex, the weight of having proven that justice, though slow and tortuous, could manifest in forms no one anticipated. Maria Clementia lived in the grand estate until her death in 1871 at the age of 52. But the 27 years she spent as owner of that house were not merely an extension of her existence. They were the deliberate building of a legacy that defied established narratives about power, race, and justice in 19th century Colombia. The first months following her acquisition of the property were ones of silent but profound transformation. Maria Clementia did not seek vengeance in the traditional sense of the word. She did not humiliate the 3 slaves she inherited with the house. She did not brand them with red-hot irons, nor did she subject them to the punishments she herself had endured. Instead, she gathered them in the same living room where Doña Catalina habitually dictated her orders and presented each of them with manumission documents. She explained to them in a firm but warm voice that they were free from that moment on, and that they could choose to stay and work for a fair wage or leave to build their lives wherever they wished. All 3 chose to remain, not out of fear or lack of alternatives, but because they recognized in Maria Clementia what they had never seen in an owner, a deep understanding of what the absence of freedom meant. She knew exactly which word, which gesture, which condition could make a person feel human or reduced to a commodity, and she used this knowledge not to dominate, but to uplift. The metamorphosis of the grand estate into a haven for free people seeking employment and stability was not fortuitous. It was part of a broader vision that Maria Clementia had begun to develop during her years of enslavement, observing the inefficiencies and cruelties of the system that oppressed her. She grasped a truth that few understood in her time, that true prosperity did not arise from extracting maximum labor at minimal human cost, but from creating conditions where individuals could flourish and, in doing so, generate shared wealth. In 1845, barely a year after acquiring the grand estate, Maria Clementia opened a small sewing workshop in one of the salons that had once served for Doña Catalina's social receptions. She hired free women, many of whom were former slaves who had bought their freedom or received it through their masters' wills. She paid them above-average market wages and taught them not only to sew but also to manage money, negotiate prices, and understand contracts. She replicated, with her own adaptations, the clandestine education Don Sebastian had provided her years earlier. The workshop prospered in a way that astonished even Cartagena's most established merchants. The women worked with a dedication that could not be bought by threats or whips. They produced superior quality clothing because they had a real incentive. A portion of the profits was distributed among them based on the quantity and quality of their work. It was a radical system for the time, a glimpse of what decades later would be called cooperative economics. In the following years, Maria Clementia expanded her business operations with the same cunning she had employed to raise money for her freedom. She acquired a warehouse at the port in 1848, a small agricultural property on the outskirts of Cartagena in 1850, and participated as a discreet investor in various commercial ventures that required capital but did not want the visibility of a black woman as a public partner. She accepted these terms not out of submission but out of pragmatism. She knew that some battles were won slowly by accumulating real economic power, while others fought for symbolic recognition. What made her way of doing business unique was how she balanced profitability and social responsibility. When the cholera epidemic struck Cartagena in 1849, Maria Clementia temporarily converted part of the Grand Estate into a care center for the sick who lacked resources to pay doctors. She did not do it out of ostentatious charity or in search of public recognition. She did it because she remembered with absolute clarity what it was like to be vulnerable and to have no one to offer help. Her relationship with Cartagena's community of free black people was complex. Some admired her as an example of what could be achieved through intelligence and determination. Others viewed her with suspicion, considering her too close to white people, too involved in the commercial system that had supported slavery. Maria Clementia never tried to resolve these tensions with explanations or justifications. She simply continued to do what she believed was right, create real economic opportunities, not just empty promises of future equality. The definitive abolition of slavery in Colombia occurred in 1851, barely 7 years after Maria Clementia acquired the Grand Estate. It was a moment of massive celebration within black communities, but Maria Clementia observed the festivities with a mixture of joy and calculated skepticism. She knew from her own experience that legal documents did not automatically eradicate the structures of power and inequality built over centuries. Legal freedom was only the first step, not the last. And she was right. The years that followed abolition demonstrated that many former slaves received their freedom without resources, without land, without education, and without the social connections necessary to prosper in an economy that remained dominated by the same white families who had owned slaves. Some ended up working in conditions barely superior to slavery, trapped by debts and abusive contracts. Maria Clementia reacted to this reality by developing her operations in a way that specifically benefited recently freed people. She created a microcredit system before the term even existed, lending small sums of money to individuals eager to start their own businesses, but lacking access to formal banks that only lent to established property owners. The interest she charged was fair, the terms were clear, and more importantly, she offered advice on managing the borrowed money. Not all projects prospered, but those that succeeded generated a multiplier effect within the community. Maria Clementia was years old, and had accumulated a fortune that rivaled that of many traditional white families in Cartagena. However, unlike them, she never used her wealth to acquire social status, nor to integrate into the elitist circle that would have rejected her anyway. Her power was economic and therefore more solid than social power, which depended on perceptions and traditions. Attempts to discredit her emerged. Rumors circulated about how she had acquired her initial capital, insinuations that she had defrauded Doña Catalina, and unfounded accusations that she maintained inappropriate relationships with white merchants in exchange for favors. Maria Clementia ignored all of this with an indifference that disarmed her detractors. She had no need to defend her reputation, for her actions spoke louder than any slander. What few people knew was that Maria Clementia maintained regular correspondence with Don Sebastian Montes, who, after being dismissed by Doña Catalina, had established his own accounting firm in Bogotá. In their letters, they exchanged not only information about business and commercial opportunities, but also reflections on the state of the country, on the real possibilities for equality in a society barely out of slavery, on the limits and potential of economic freedom as a tool for social transformation. Don Sebastian traveled to Cartagena in 1862 and stayed at the Grand Estate for 2 weeks. It was the first time they had met since the tumultuous days of 1843. They walked together through the same corridors where years earlier they had secretly conspired to amass the price of freedom. And Don Sebastian confessed to her what Maria Clementia had already sensed, that by helping her, he had healed his own wounds. He had been born free by a happy accident of birth, not by merit, and had always felt a diffuse guilt about the privileges it conferred upon him, while others, equally capable, remained enslaved. Helping Maria Clementia had been his way of giving profound meaning to this accidental privilege. The final years of Maria Clemencia's life were marked by consolidation rather than expansion. She gradually began to transfer the management of her affairs to the people she had trained for years, creating a structure where ownership and control were distributed among several managers instead of being concentrated in a single person. It was her way of ensuring that what she had built would endure beyond her own existence. At the age of 8 years old, Maria Clementia began to experience health problems that the doctors of the time could not accurately diagnose. It was probably a form of heart or kidney disease, conditions for which there was then no effective treatment. During the following 2 years, her physical vigor gradually declined, although her mind remained sharp until the end. She spent her last months organizing her affairs with the same meticulousness she had applied to every aspect of her life. Her will was an extraordinarily detailed document that distributed her assets among the people who had worked with her, with specific provisions to ensure that none of these properties would be sold to families who had owned slaves. It was a legally debatable clause, but well drafted enough to withstand initial challenges. Maria Clementia passed away on March 3, 1871, surrounded not by the blood family she had never reconnected with, but by the family she had chosen and built. The women of the sewing workshop, the managers of her businesses, the people who had found in her not a boss but a mentor and an ally. Her funeral was an extraordinary event for Cartagena. Hundreds of free black people attended, recognizing her as a symbol of what was possible to achieve. But white merchants who had dealt with her also came and had learned to respect her astuteness and her word. The procession that carried her body to the cemetery deliberately passed in front of what had been the house where Doña Catalina had lived her last years in poverty and isolation. This was not cruelty, but a silent reminder of how destiny had rewritten 2 lives that had begun at opposite ends of the social hierarchy. Doña Catalina had died 19 years earlier, in 1852, in relative poverty. Her disappearance went practically unnoticed, recorded in parish registers with the impersonal brevity of someone who no longer mattered to anyone. She left no significant inheritance, no legacy worthy of mention. Her name survived only in legal documents and in the memories of those who remembered her cruelty as a warning about the dangers of power devoid of empathy. The contrast between these 2 deaths, between these 2 legacies, says more about justice and the meaning of existence than any philosophical treatise. This story compels us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of power and justice. Was this a vengeance that Maria Clementia carried out? In the traditional sense? Number. She never sought to inflict the same suffering she had endured, but in a deeper and more complex sense, perhaps so. The vengeance of demonstrating that the social order Doña Catalina considered immutable was in reality fragile and contingent. The vengeance of proving that intelligence and determination could surpass the advantages of birth, the vengeance of living well and building meaning in a world that had tried to reduce her to a commodity. What makes this story particularly relevant is not only the extraordinary facts it describes, but also what it reveals about systems of oppression and the possibilities of resistance. Maria Clementia did not wait for others to grant her freedom out of compassion or through legal reforms. She built it herself, step by step, with a patience that required an almost superhuman psychological strength. She lived for years with the contradiction of being legally enslaved while developing the skills and accumulating the resources that would ultimately free her. Her story also reminds us that individual liberation, while important, is not sufficient. Maria Clementia could have simply used her freedom to ensure her own comfort and security. Instead, she chose to create structures that would facilitate the emancipation and prosperity of others. She intuitively understood what decades later would be articulated as a theory: that true freedom is collective, that no one is fully free as long as others remain oppressed. In the archives of Cartagena, among documents yellowed and fragile with time, there still remain the registers that attest to the transfer of ownership of the grand estate to Maria Clementia. There are the notarial deeds of her other properties, the account books that reveal the profitability of her businesses, the wills that distributed her wealth. These are silent but irrefutable testimonies that in 1843, in a city where slavery was still legal and structural racism defined every aspect of social life, a woman accomplished the impossible. But beyond legal documents and commercial records, Maria Clementia's true legacy lies in the question her life poses to each generation. What will we do about the injustices we observe? Will we passively wait for oppressive systems to collapse under their own weight? Or will we actively build the alternatives we wish to see? Will we use the power we accumulate to replicate existing hierarchies or to create new possibilities? Maria Clementia chose to build. She chose to transmute her suffering into wisdom, her oppression into strategy, and her personal liberation into collective opportunity. She was not without flaws. She did not solve all the ills of her time, nor did she eradicate racism or inequality in Colombia. But within the space she could influence, through the lives she could touch, she demonstrated that a different world was possible. Such was the vengeance no one expected. Not the destruction of the oppressor, but the construction of alternatives so robust that oppression itself seemed obsolete. Not the dramatic spectacle of immediate justice, but the slow, meticulous, and cumulative labor of creating dignity where previously only humiliation existed. Not the proclamation of theoretical equality, but the practical demonstration of an ability that no prejudice could deny. Maria Clementia's story reminds us that the most transformative moments are not always the most visible. It was not the signing of her manumission act that marked the most crucial moment of her life, although it was legally significant. It was every day spent studying figures in secret. Every strategic decision on how to accumulate and protect her resources. Every moment she chose calculated patience rather than immediate gratification. True transformation occurs in invisible spaces, in small decisions that, when accumulated, lead to monumental changes. And so, in a house in Cartagena that was once a theater of cruelty and oppression, Maria Clementia wrote with her life a definitive answer to the question of whether justice is possible in an unjust world. The answer is yes, but not in the way we expect. It does not come from above, like a proclamation of benevolent authority. It arises from below, built by individuals who refuse to accept that the circumstances of their birth define them. It arrives slowly, painfully, demanding sacrifices that should not be necessary, but it arrives. Such is the final lesson Maria Clementia bequeaths to us. True power does not lie in the ability to control others, but in mastering one's own destiny. True victory is not defeating our oppressors by their own rules, but creating entirely new rules where oppression no longer has meaning. True freedom is not merely the absence of chains, but the presence of possibilities. Under the relentless sun of Cartagena, an impossible story became reality, pushing the boundaries of what all future generations could envision as possible. Such is the legacy that no tomb could contain, no document fully grasp, and no future injustice erase. And yet, there is another truth that must be told about this story. A truth that transcends documented facts and enters the territory of what this memory means, of what it means to preserve memory in a world constantly striving to erase the most unsettling truths. When Maria Clementia passed away in 1871, she left specific and detailed instructions in her will concerning the fate of the grand residence. The property could not be sold to any family that had owned slaves at any point in its history. A revolutionary clause that her legal heirs attempted to challenge, deeming it excessively restrictive and practically unverifiable. The legal disputes lasted nearly 5 years, consuming resources and sparking heated debates in Cartagena's legal circles. Eventually, under pressure from creditors and due to the complexity of maintaining the restriction, the property was divided and sold off. But as long as the clause remained in effect, it forced every lawyer, notary, and potential buyer in Cartagena to meticulously review historical records of slave ownership. It was a forced confrontation with a past many would have preferred to bury. An excavation of family sins that the elites considered buried forever. The descendants of the women who worked in Maria Clementia's sewing workshop continued the activities for 2 more generations until the end of the 19th century, when industrialization fundamentally changed the nature of the textile trade in Colombia. But the cooperative structure she had established, where the workers shared profits proportionally to their labor and actively participated in decisions regarding production and prices, left a profound mark on how some Afro-descendant communities in Cartagena organized their economic activities in the following decades. It was not just a business model, it was a life philosophy that shared prosperity was more sustainable and just than individual exploitation. There is an extraordinarily fascinating detail in the municipal archives of Cartagena, rarely mentioned in official histories, probably because it challenges comfortable narratives about progress and oblivion. In 1875, exactly 4 years after Maria Clementia's death, a group of 12 Afro-descendant women, all former employees of her various businesses or daughters of her workers, submitted a formal petition to the municipal council. They sought authorization to establish a textile and food trade cooperative with a shared ownership structure and democratic management. In this extraordinarily well-written and argued document, they explicitly cited the model Maria Clementia had created as a historical precedent and legal justification. They argued that if one woman had successfully established such a structure for decades, there was no legal or moral reason to deny them the same right. The petition was rejected for technical reasons that barely concealed the true motive: the fear of the white commercial elites of seeing a precedent for independent economic organization established within Afro-descendant communities. The official reasons cited irregularities in the incorporation documents and concerns about the petitioners' ability to manage their tax obligations. But the municipal council minutes preserved in the archives reveal comments from councilors who clearly expressed their discomfort with the idea of black women operating businesses without the supervision of white patrons. The rejection was a tactical defeat, but the very fact that such a petition existed, that these women knew Maria Clementia's story in enough detail to invoke it as a legal argument, that they had the audacity to present themselves before authorities who considered them inferior, demonstrates that Maria Clementia's legacy did not die with her. It lived in the imagination and determination of those who remembered her. The story we have reconstructed is extraordinary for its facts, but perhaps even more important for the arduous questions it poses to each generation that discovers it. Why do names like Maria Clementia not appear in textbooks when we study the history of Colombia? Why do scholastic narratives celebrate merchants and politicians whose fortunes were built on slavery, yet ignore those who resisted and overcame that very slavery? The answer is as unsettling as it is necessary, because official historical narratives have been written preferentially by and for the descendants of those who held institutional power, not by those who challenged it from the margins. This selectivity is neither accidental nor neutral. It is a form of epistemological violence, a deliberate attempt to control which stories are deemed worthy of telling, which lives are considered worthy of remembering. When we erase from collective memory stories like Maria Clementia's, we do not merely commit a historical injustice against her specifically, we commit an injustice against all future generations who need to know that people in impossible circumstances found ways to transform their reality. We limit the horizon of the possible. We reduce the spectrum of models of resistance and transformation available to those who today face their own oppressions. Preserving and disseminating stories like this is not simply an act of historical justice, though it is certainly that. It is fundamentally an act of political imagination and pragmatic hope. When young Afro-descendants in Colombia, Latin America, or anywhere else in the world learn that in 1843, under conditions that seemed designed to make any form of liberation impossible, a woman accomplished what Maria Clementia achieved, this radically expands the scope of what they can consider possible in their own lives. The narratives we tell ourselves about the past are not passive entertainment. They are maps, tools, fuel for imagining different futures. Maria Clementia never wrote memoirs, never kept a diary, never recorded a first-person account of her lived experience. This absence is painfully common in the histories of enslaved and marginalized people. Their voices reach us filtered, fragmented, mediated, reconstructed from records created by others for entirely distinct purposes. Legal acts of sale and acquisition, notarial transaction records, property inventories where human beings appear listed between furniture and animals. Each fragment of information about Maria Clementia had to be extracted from archives that were never designed to honor her humanity, but to document her status as property, and then as an unusual owner. And yet, even in these arid and bureaucratic fragments, even in the cold language of contracts and deeds, the force of her will, the clarity of her strategic vision, the superhuman persistence of her determination shines with an intensity that no document can fully contain, nor any silence extinguish. The figures in accounting ledgers tell a story of methodical accumulation. The dates inscribed on property titles tell a story of impossible ascent. The clauses of her will tell a story of vision that extended beyond her own life. Every bureaucratic record is inadvertently a monument to her genius. This is the story we must carry forward. Not as a mere historical curiosity, not as an exceptional anecdote confirming the general rule of oppression, but as systematic proof that structures of domination, however solid and permanent they may seem, always conceal flaws, contradictions, spaces for maneuver, and that extraordinary individuals, armed with intelligence, patience, and unwavering determination, have repeatedly found ways to identify these flaws and expand them into paths toward freedom. Maria Clementia's story is both a testament to the past and an urgent invitation to the present to observe our own circumstances with a critical eye, to identify the cracks in the structures that limit and oppress us, and to possess the monumental courage to systematically widen them. In the noisy streets of Cartagena today, among tourists photographing colonial architecture and vendors offering souvenirs, very few know the name of Maria Clementia. No statue in public squares, no commemorative plaque on buildings, no street bears her name, no official monument honors her memory. The Colombian state, so prolific in erecting statues of generals and politicians, never considered that a woman who transitioned from slavery to ownership, through pure ingenuity, deserved public recognition. This absence of official recognition is itself a political statement about the lives deemed worthy of commemoration. But in the archives, in the yellowed and fragile documents that have survived more than a century and a half of Caribbean humidity and institutional neglect, her name remains indelible. Maria Clementia, owner, merchant, liberator, visionary. And in this archival persistence lies a powerful promise that true stories, regardless of the efforts of contemporary elites and subsequent generations to conceal, ignore, or minimize them, find unexpected voices to survive, to re-emerge at crucial moments, to remind us who we truly are as a society and what we are truly capable of achieving when we collectively refuse to accept the limits that others try to impose on us. Such is the final vengeance no one expected or could anticipate. Not the violent destruction of the oppressor, not the exemplary punishment of the guilty, not the public humiliation of the one who humiliated, but something far more lasting and transformative. The unwavering persistence of memory against organized oblivion, the insistence of real history against sanitized official narratives. The absolute refusal, generation after generation, to be forgotten, silenced, or relegated to a footnote. Maria Clementia gained her freedom by purchasing it through intelligence and patience. She bought her dignity through strategy and work. She built her legacy with vision and generosity toward those who came after her. And by accomplishing all of this under conditions designed to make every step impossible, she demonstrated a truth that resonates through the centuries, that true victory is not measured by the temporary defeat of the enemy, but by the creation of alternatives so solid, so real, so materially existing, and so well documented that the world has no choice but to finally recognize them, even when that recognition comes centuries later, when all protagonists are already dust, but their actions remain an indestructible testament to human possibility.